Venezuela, a country painted as a failed state by US politicians and corporate media. One that is under a total dictatorship, brutally repressing free speech and the right to protest. The protests, which have been going on for 3 months, are across the board uncritically romanticized and celebrated by the mass media. Many outlets are openly calling for regime change. Since President Chavez was elected in 1998, the US government has paid over $50 million to the opposition movement. Now, Senator Marco Rubio just spearheaded a bill pledging another $20 million to, quote, defend human rights, among other types of aid. Long wanting to overthrow the democratically elected socialist government, US politicians are seizing the moment of unrest for regime change.
The stable and peaceful Venezuela is in the best interest of the entire hemisphere. We will be working with Colombia and other countries on the Venezuelan problem. It is a very, very horrible problem, and from a humanitarian standpoint, it is like nothing we've seen in quite a long time.
With new US sanctions, direct threats from the Trump administration to overthrow another sovereign government, and corporate media painting a one-sided narrative, I wanted to go see the reality on the ground for myself. During my investigation in Venezuela, spending nearly 3 weeks in Caracas, one thing was a constant: traffic jams from guarimbas, or protest barricades, intended to disrupt life in the city. While most things carried on like normal, some parts of the city were always inaccessible, with police and military constantly scurrying to whatever streets were shut down that day. Knowing how much mass protests define life in Venezuela, as well as the media coverage, I attended an opposition protest in Miranda State near Caracas. The demonstration, which consisted of thousands of people, was a peaceful gathering, with typical speeches and chants.
What is your biggest problem with what's happening right now?
I think right now the biggest problem is that the president don't want us to go to election, because if we go, he knows he's gonna lose.
Ya que aquí no hay constitución, no hay Estado de Derecho, no existe el imperio de las leyes. Estamos en una total dictadura en Venezuela, una represión, hay una tiranía constante. Fuera el dictador de Venezuela, no lo queremos.
Estamos sufriendo de hambre, de miseria, de angustia, desesperación, y que lo que queremos es que este régimen se largue del país junto con todos los seguidores, para que en Venezuela venga la paz, la tranquilidad y el amor entre los venezolanos.
17 years and some months, the country is every day falling down. It doesn't work if you don't have money. If you have money, excuse me. Because if you have money, you need medicine. You don't have where to buy it.
I have 27 years old and I'm married. And my wife, she doesn't buy anything that she wants to.
You said you've been fighting since 2002. What happened? Why have you been fighting so long in the streets?
Because I've never been Chavista, because I knew that where it will end everything, okay? Because they have a wrong idea what revolution is. My father took me to a riot, and one riot take me another, and it happened years.
Sembrar el comunismo, nunca más, una Cuba 2, eso es todo. Y Cuba no nos libera, porque si nos liberamos, no van a seguir comiendo.
Is the United States doing enough to help Venezuela?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we are helping. A lot of Venezuelans live in the States, so we send the Green Cross, the one who help with the medicine, the ones who help the protesters that get hit. They get a lot of help from the States.
Ojalá que así fuera, que tanto Estados Unidos como todos los países del mundo pusieran un granito de arena para que metan la mano por Venezuela.
Is the United States doing enough to help Venezuela?
Sí, lo está haciendo muy bien, junto con Luis Almagro, pero necesitamos ya un desenlace, necesitamos un final feliz. Queremos el apoyo internacional importante de los Estados Unidos, de Nueva York, para que nos ayuden sin cesar. Necesitamos que Estados Unidos afine su potencia hacia nosotros va a ser bien recibida.
We are very near Plaza Altamira right now, where the opposition looks like it's setting up a barricade. This is a tactic that the opposition does to deter traffic, to cause a lot of problems here in Caracas. We're going to go follow them right now and see what's going on.
As the sun started to set, things began to change. Smaller groups donning masks and shields started forming up. While the majority of the crowd held a candlelight vigil to commemorate those killed in the protests, the others lit flames of their own. They poured incendiary liquid in the streets and began stopping traffic.
We're here in the middle of the plaza. There are thousands of protesters down there for the March of the Torches. Right now, there are a couple dozen protesters right here with shields, helmets, masks. They're lighting fires. They're doing a blockade. They say their tactics is get as many people out in the street as they possibly can.
Bueno, hasta lo que sabemos nosotros protestamos porque queremos una mejor Venezuela como la de antes, como, cónchale, fíjate, bueno, hasta lo que sabemos, Cuba por lo menos es una dictadura, pues. Y nosotros no podemos vivir con unos cubanos aquí en Venezuela porque es chimbo y mírate, a través de esta dictadura que estamos pasando, escasez y comida y todo eso, y bueno, solamente queremos volver a retomar lo que era antes, pues.
And how many people have the government killed, security forces, military, police so far?
Han habido como más de como 200, menos, como 180 muertos.
And what are the demands right now for protesters?
Lo que nosotros pedimos es nada más que todo que sacar al presidente. O sea, nosotros pedimos unas elecciones, luchamos por unas elecciones porque queremos que cambie todo y necesitamos un nuevo presidente que ayude a nuestro país, pues.
El único mensaje que le podemos mandar nosotros a la resistencia al mundo entero es ayuda. Esa es la primordial que le podemos pedir, porque si vamos al caso, nosotros salimos a la calle y los primeros que reprimen son el gobierno. Ahorita porque no tenemos las balas que nos están lanzando, que son unas metras grandes de hierro, por el cual han matado a varios. Ayer el chamo que mataron a los tecos lo mataron de una metra. Y eso es mentira, no lanzan ni perdigón ni lanzan bomba, lanzan plomo. Eso es lo que lanzan, plomo y tiro.
Una bala, y eso es verdad. Porque dice Maduro que es mentira, si es verdad, que ellos puro echan tiro.
Several times we were aggressively surrounded by masked protesters, demanding to see what media outlet we worked for. Only when they heard that we were from the United States did they back down, but told me to only film repression against them, not their actions. As the crowd grew, they announced they would be marching to block the major freeway. Protesters and squadrons of motorbikes began mobbing through the streets, setting fires and creating roadblocks along the way.
So we're here at the highway right now. We just talked to some protesters who said that they're blocking the highway. They just set up a barricade of fire. They're doing it down there. The National Guard is about to come, which they say they want us to see how they oppress them when they do come.
Stopping cars leaving the highway, they trapped drivers on the off-ramp. I talked to several in the heat of the offensive.
Por los momentos no ha hecho nada, pero por lo menos venimos a representar el día de hoy de que todavía no nos hemos quedado quietos, no nos hemos quedado tranquilos, todavía estamos en lucha por la libertad y lucha por esta dictadura que tenemos de 17 años.
How hard is it to live under a dictatorship?
Es bastante difícil porque tú como emprendedora no emprendes no para ti, sino para el gobierno, ¿me entiendes? No puedes ser independiente, ¿ves? Todo tu trabajo y tu esfuerzo es para el gobierno y eso es lo que no queremos aquí.
What is this? What are you carrying?
Esta es una trifácil. Esta es la que nos lanzan a nosotros.
Y con esto han matado a compañeros de nosotros en el pecho y los han impactado con esto. Y toda esa gente corrupta y enchufada se tiene que ir y presos tienen que ir. Porque no es posible que aquí se maten las personas por adquirir una harina pan o un arroz. Cuando el gobierno nos tiene que subastar todas esas cosas porque es el derecho de un ser humano libre del trabajo y la libertad a la comida y la libertad de expresión.
Claro, claro,
¡Libertad! ¡Resistencia activa!
Then the protest moved onto the highway itself, shutting down all lanes in both directions. Most surprising is how they did this, taking over 2 large trucks.
So right now we're on the highway. Every single entrance to the highway has been blockaded, lit on fire, and now we're looking at 2 enormous trucks that have been somehow taken over and maneuvered in order to block the main thoroughfare of the highway right now.
Protesters held the freeway like this for some time, according to them, waiting for state forces to respond. Then they commandeered a 3rd truck, pushing it towards the edge of the freeway. Below was Miranda Air Force Base. They started hurling rocks and chunks of concrete at the base below, and that's when soldiers guarding the base responded. They fired several tear gas canisters that landed directly in front of me and my team, and the protesters quickly retreated from the freeway back to the streets above.
Apparently there's an Air Force base there and they're throwing rocks to the big blockade, and then they hurled tear gas canisters over the side. We got hit, but not really hard because it wasn't that close.
The protest regrouped at their fallback position, when National Guard soldiers I couldn't see fired more tear gas. This time, staying on the front lines hurt a bit more.
So yeah, right after I said I didn't get hit hard with tear gas, we're running away, and there's all these provocations with the police and the protesters, and they just started hurling tear gas canisters at us, and we were just caught in a huge plume of tear gas. It was extremely painful. My eyes are really, really burning. I felt like I was blind for like 5 minutes, so that just happened.
While soldiers had cleared the freeway, protesters continued to block several intersections in the area, with more trucks and barricades. What I had experienced was a typical guarimba, a few hundred or less semi-armed protesters ruling the streets, shutting down as much as they can, using largely violent tactics. They push as far as they can go until security forces respond, then flee with new photos of repression. Given what the media has been saying, I was shocked to learn that there were no arrests that night. It seems like there certainly is a right to protest in Venezuela, and the curated images we see in the news are obscuring a much darker, deadlier reality. Since the beginning of the protest on April 6th through July 1st, we found 95 deaths attributed to the protests, with over 1,000 injured. Of that 95, 11 have unknown or undetermined connections to the protests, and are murders that took place in the vicinity of a protest. So let's look at the remaining 84 deaths. It is true that many protesters have been killed by police and the National Guard. Several have been killed in shootings, and 2 killed by tear gas. According to Venezuela's Attorney General, one of the most outspoken critics of the government's response, 23 deaths are attributed to state forces. Many investigations into alleged killings by state forces are still ongoing. In several cases, people were first reported in the media to have been killed by state forces, but evidence later revealed that they were actually killed by opposition weapons. But let's assume that number is correct, 23. So if only 23 out of the 84 are attributed to state forces, what has caused the majority of the deaths, the remaining 61? Those 61 actually have been caused by opposition protesters. Many of those killed directly in murders and political assassinations. Let's look at those numbers that so many unquestioningly attribute to state repression. We found 23 to have been indirectly killed by opposition violence in a variety of ways. For example, 6 people have died in vehicle accidents while trying to escape opposition barricades. 3 are civilians who died because opposition barricades prevented life-saving ambulances from reaching them. 9 of those 23 are opposition protesters who accidentally killed themselves. 1 in an explosion from an opposition mortar, and 8 electrocuted themselves to death while looting a bakery. In addition to these indirect deaths from opposition violence, 38 people have been directly killed by opposition violence. 16 of those 38 are seemingly random killings of civilians at opposition barricades or near a protest. 7 of the 38 are police and National Guard members killed by protesters. 6 of them were shot by protesters, and 1 National Guard member was beaten to death by a mob of protesters. One would think these facts would be included in a fair report of force used by the state. But more heinously, 14 deaths are political murders and assassinations of Chavistas and government supporters by the opposition. Most were targeted for attending a pro-government demonstration or for being identified as Chavistas. 2 were socialist figures who were kidnapped, tortured, and executed. Most chilling was the lynching of 21-year-old Orlando Figueroa, who was brutally beaten, stabbed, and burned alive by opposition protesters. According to an interview with Orlando in the hospital, they yelled, "Hey black guy, see what happens to Chavistas," before throwing a Molotov cocktail on him and lighting him aflame. Orlando died from his injuries just days later. At least 4 other people have been set on fire but lived, allegedly for being Chavistas, and many others brutally beaten by opposition mobs. So of those 84 fatalities associated with the protest movement, 23 deaths are allegedly from state repression, and 61 deaths from opposition violence. As surprised as I was to see that the reality of these numbers is so warped, I was completely unprepared for what would happen to me for simply reporting these facts. Because I questioned the validity of the fatality count being 100% due to state forces, prominent opposition spokespeople created a false hysteria over an outrageous lie that myself and Empire Files producer Mike Preisner were not journalists, but in fact working directly for the government intelligence forces, and that we weren't actually conducting interviews of protesters, but taking their pictures to turn into police forces. And not only that, but the police had then arrested protesters based on our intelligence. The life-threatening lie was first promoted by professor at Venezuela's Simón Bolívar University and opposition activist, José Vicente Carrasquero. The rumors were echoed and exaggerated by several prominent opposition journalists, like Manuel Malaver and Miami reporter Angie Perez. The disinformation campaign incited a virtual lynch mob against us for days, which translated into real-life stalking and threats, calls to fine and kill us, doxing of personal information, and more. Revealing their characters, scores of opposition Twitter accounts specifically used the word lynch when calling for violence against us. More than that, this opposition hate campaign also posted the address of an event Mike was speaking at, inciting people to come confront us, and worse. Dozens of Venezuelan expats actually showed up, chanting against socialism, and tried to physically force their way into the event to disrupt it. But the threats of violence were not empty. Just days later, a Telesur journalist was actually shot in the back by opposition protesters when her and her team were viciously attacked with Molotov cocktails, bullets, and explosives. Many other journalists have also been called infiltrators and attacked, like when a Global Vision crew was doused with gasoline by protesters at a recent demonstration and told to leave or they would get burned. Amazingly, international human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and the Committee to Protect Journalists have been silent on the attacks on journalists from the opposition and have only condemned the government for press repression. For as much as Venezuela's poor is used as the basis of the international media campaign to oust the government, the poor people from the barrios of Venezuela are not the ones protesting. The marches and violent guarimbas are concentrated in only a few states, where the middle and upper class areas are, most of them run by opposition governors or mayors. And the targets of the protesters speak volumes about the nature of the opposition. Factories, public transportation, Socialist Party offices, hospitals, and clinics have all been attacked. Even the childhood home of Chavez was set on fire. They've also set fire to the government's housing ministry, the Supreme Court, and more. In one case, a maternity clinic was raided, and the facility besieged by opposition forces for 2 days. A cultural center I visited, which gave free music lessons to youth and provided space for art collectives, had also recently been attacked and vandalized by opposition protesters. Ironically, even though protesters use food shortages as one of their main grievances, they frequently attack food distribution centers. Most recently, they burned a warehouse containing 50 tons of food intended for school children. The representatives of the opposition don't denounce the violent guarimbas sustained by the small contingent of protesters. In fact, top opposition leaders have directly called for violence. But there's another side of this story: the millions of Venezuelan voices who are rendered invisible to the Western media.
Ha habido una guerra económica muy fuerte de parte de los sectores de la élite burguesa y los empresarios hacia como el pueblo, pues a los que producen los alimentos, los que producen los artículos de primera necesidad, lo han venido como que acaparando, escondiéndolo, algo parecido como lo que se hacía a Salvador Allende en Chile.
Mira, realmente por un proceso de polarización en el que estamos viviendo actualmente en Venezuela, hemos llegado a un punto donde ya la tolerancia es cero, donde ya identificarte con algo de la revolución o algo que tenga que ver por lo menos haciendo ejemplo de lo que es el comandante Chávez, debido a que nos señalan, nos golpean, nos queman, nos matan, nos categorizan por nuestro color de piel, por nuestro cabello. Es una cantidad de factores que han generado que nosotros los revolucionarios tengamos como que un poco de temor a salir a la calle porque nos identifican fácilmente, porque no tenemos miedo a usar cuestiones que nos identifiquen como en la revolución bolivariana, que nos identifiquen como chavistas. Entonces, la situación en la calle es bastante tensa, bastante complicada por esa situación, por un grupo de personas que no creen en la tolerancia, que no cree y que no respeta al otro por pensar distinto.
And what do they do to you if they see that you're a Chavista? I mean, what have they done to people who identify themselves as this?
Nos señalan, nos arrinconan, nos amenazan, por lo menos a mí. En mi casa, en mi edificio, yo tuve la oportunidad de recibir por parte de la revolución un vehículo, un carro, un Arauca, y con excremento de humano me lo regaron a través en el capó. Me rayaron el carro, le escriben cosas a mi mamá por ser vocera del Consejo Comunal y de este nuevo sistema de llevar la comida a las casas, que es el club. A mi mamá la señalan y le rayan en el ascensor, le insultan, me señalan en la calle. Entonces, eso es lo que nos pasa a nosotros los chavistas por ser chavistas, ¿ves? Por querer ayudar a los otros, nos señalan y nos vejan, pues, nos maltratan.
Pero sí hay como que una gente que tiene odio, pues, tienen odio y quieren como que reprimirlo hacia la gente, golpear a la gente, quieren problemas, pues, pero lo que te digo, son focos minoritarios. Si vamos a un término estadístico.
Do you think that you live in a dictatorship?
No, vale, para nada. Aquí tú puedes observar que la gente tiene libre tránsito, la gente hace lo que quiere, participa, habla, incluso hasta están quemando el país, sectores de los terroristas de la derecha fascista. Ellos incluso están quemando el país, han hecho actos vandálicos, actos terroristas, y no se les ha aplicado la ley con esa fuerza como se hace por lo menos en Estados Unidos, en Europa. Esas personas andan por ahí haciendo lo que quieren. Aquí las personas tienen libre albedrío, libre forma de pensar, de creer, libre de creer lo político, lo económico, lo social, lo cultural, lo religioso. Aquí, el que diga que hay una dictadura está completamente desquiciado. Entonces, ¿en qué estado de dictadura es ese que hay elecciones, que participa la gente, que la gente hace lo que quiere? Eso es completamente ilógico.
Yo soy una joven 100% revolucionaria, chavista, y creo que lo que están haciendo del lado de la derecha, los opositores, no me parece, porque creo que los problemas no se resuelven así como lo están haciendo ella, de manera violenta, ocasionando un caos en las calles de Venezuela, en las calles de Caracas, atacando a nuestros defensores, a las policías, a las guardias nacionales. Creo que eso se discute mediante un diálogo, resolviendo todas las cosas, y creo que mientras ellos no busquen un plan de trabajo, no busquen un líder, creo que ellos nunca van a poder sacar a este gobierno tan revolucionario y bolivariano que tenemos hoy en día.
pero son personas que como son violentas, entonces tienden a transmitir la violencia con gritos, con golpes, con todos esos elementos lúdicos que los caracterizan de golpes, de violencia, pero nadie tiene miedo aquí. Aquí incluso hay muchas personas que se han contenido de no caer en el mismo juego de ellos de violencia y de golpear a las personas y de caer en sus mismos pensamientos porque pensamos y creemos que no es esa la intención, pues que la forma sería como que más bien dialogar y llegar a una solución pacífica como personas racionales, pues dentro de la filosofía y el pensamiento aristotélico humano. Pero aquí nadie tiene miedo, más bien hay grupos también de la izquierda que son muy radicales, que quisieran como que también darle su merecido a esos muchachos, pero no lo hemos hecho porque creemos que la solución es netamente racional, pues no vamos a caer en eso del cerebro reptil, de nada más de golpear a las personas, de caer en su mismo juego.